My name is Atin Gupta. I'm your host today at one of our growth series. The topic for discussion today is innovation in accounting firms. There's about 800 million jobs are lost to automation since 2018. That's a McKinsey global report. 83% of the people say they adapt technology to remain competitive. There's no other way out of it, especially in professional services. 70% of the role says they're becoming more strategic. They're no longer providing value in compliance as much as they're providing value in getting in front of the clients and doing things with them collaboratively. Internally, 40% of the individuals struggle to understand current technology. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it. And this was the research done by Blackline in 2019. Like 40% struggle to understand the current technology. Almost 111 days lost each year to identify and rectify statements that we do. And 41% of the reporting numbers are inaccurate due to human error. Those are very, very large numbers. So what that means is that if you are earning $100,000, you're putting $140,000 worth of work to earn $100,000. That $40,000 is completely lost in translation. And yet we still feel ourselves behind the eight ball for some reason. So we're going to talk a little bit about how innovation has changed or is changing, or in some cases have evolved extensively over the course of time. This fellow, a good friend of mine now, I've had the opportunity to get to know him at a personal level, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for the friendship I think we have. He's a partner and COO at Fuller LPP. He's one of the leaders I believe, in the technology consulting practice at the firm. At the same time, a very good thought leader in terms of really being vocal about how the industry is changing and how we need to change as an industry. He's been a partner and still, I think, is a partner within the valuations practice. I'd like to invite Ohran Gobrin.
Hi, Atin. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
You're always welcome, and it's a pleasure to always talk to you. Jumping into our Q&A part of the session, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about innovation. As you know, this topic particularly talks innovation, and there's a lot of noise around what innovation is. I find that there's a lot of confusion around it. I'm trying to understand from your personal perspective, what does innovation means to you in the accounting firm's industry concept?
So I think the best place to start is just to recognize that innovation is change. And change requires, first of all, the recognition that there's a need to change and an investment in managing that change, whether it's time, whether it's dollars. There needs to be some sort of level of investment in change. So if we start innovation just on that basic concept of change, that gives us an element of language that we can start to work with. Now, the question is, well, what's driving change and what change do I need to respond to? So on the one hand, you can say, well, things change all the time. And certainly we live in a time and a space where change has become increasingly more rapid. So part of the challenge that we face today across industry, but certainly in the accounting industry, is to try and tease out which changes are relevant that require a response and that we should be thinking about. The second part of change is a question of how to respond to change, not just which forces of change should we respond to, but how to respond and when to respond. And you need to sort of figure out how things evolve and where you want to be on the development curve, on the early parts of change, and the middle parts of change, and the later parts of change, and understand the consequences of each of those choices.
Is change misunderstood?
Well, there are a couple of basic human elements to that we need to square up to. The one is that change requires energy, and the default position is the most comfortable because it doesn't require investment. The second is that we're somewhat concerned with failure and the cost of failure, and we've started to move in the technology world to a sense of let's iterate more rapidly and allow for those failures and celebrate those failures. It runs somewhat counter to many personalities, and it's not something that's easy en masse to do, to accept that and accept each of those as growing points.
If we think change, innovation is change, and change is so important, and it's an inevitable part of our being personally and professionally. And yet we still come back to this notion of it's like, maybe it's not time yet.
People don't change for the sake of change. They change because there's a good reason to change, and there's a good reason to go and invest the energy required for change. So the inability to articulate, call it the reason, the vision, the objective, in a succinct way and motivate the community of your organization to push in that direction, I think is the largest impediment to change in the industry today.
The bigger the organization, the bigger the challenge. Is that a fair statement?
You assume that a small organization has a nimbleness, but small organizations also have historic and cultural elements to them, which sometimes have an effect of either keeping everybody happy or wanting to make sure that everybody's on the right page first, and it can slow down that point of realization of we need to push this forward because you've got more people to get on board.
You know, what I realize is that everybody in your internal or close environment that is impacting our practice or industry as a whole is constantly pushing. You have to change, you have to adapt, you have to grow, you have to make these changes, and then digital transformation is here and it's moving at a faster pace and you're going to be left behind. Are we creating some sort of a negative fear of missing out? Is like forcing people to actually do change faster than it needs to be?
I think the important thing here is to know your culture, because your culture is going to inform the level of innovation that's executable within your organization. So you can nurture a culture of innovation within your firm. In other words, you can continue to create the environment that fosters and allows your people to grow and become more innovative. But at any point in time, you can't innovate beyond your cultural maturity. And what I mean by that is that successful innovation is a function of an organization's ability to absorb change. So that change needs to be visioned, articulated, and then ultimately absorbed into the organization through the initial parts of change management, and then finally the ongoing execution. Each organization will have its own cultural affinity for doing that, and it's appropriate to then shape your innovation plan against what's manageable for the organization. So your question initially around, well, is it okay to go slower and more in a more tempered fashion? Absolutely. If that's where you are as an organization, you should be innovating at a tempo that's consistent with where you are as an organization and your ability to integrate those changes. If you can accelerate it, and there's reason to accelerate it, then acceleration is appropriate. At the end of the day, if you think about management sitting on two dials, cultural maturity and speed of innovation, you really need to keep those in balance, because too fast fails, too slow is frustrating, and it's a subtle dance to be able to make sure that you're culturally innovating and you're technology or otherwise innovating as appropriate for your organization.
I believe the way you said it, change is only required when it's needed. Do not go and look for a change just because the guy next to you said, I think this change is required. Look how much money I'm making. Look how much things are happening. And then there are driving forces that allows you to go out and start pushing your boundaries without really understanding what the limitations of your organization collectively there is. And our goal when we started Countable was very simple. Like we wanted to drive change, not innovation as much. How do you weed out scenarios when you have the purpose aligned of things that you want to focus on versus things that are not ready to be focused on yet?
It often comes back to, what are we doing? What's the purpose of what we're doing and where are we shooting for? It's important to have that constantly in mind in some articulated framework in which to test where you're headed. So let's ground that somewhat. If the objective is to become just simply a paperless environment, you're an accounting firm that still has a lot of legacy systems, and your objection is to become a paperless environment, then you've got an articulated goal. You have everyone aligned against the goal, and you have a commitment to developing against the goal. Now, the practical application of that becomes, well, what are the consequences of becoming a paperless environment? And what are the implications for the organization? The mantra I like to use internally at our firm is that we explore very widely, but we only implement responsibly. So you may think about simply the technology element of it, but there are other elements to a project of that nature which impact human capital elements, cultural elements, workflow elements. There are a lot of pieces that get touched that need to be managed and redesigned or re-innovated. So by putting those on the table as those are the areas that need to explore, you're in a position to explore widely and look at options quite liberally and test a complete range of what's possible and where you'd like to go. But at some point, we need to draw the line and say to ourselves, what makes sense from a portfolio of initiatives that we're going to bring together that will most effectively serve the enterprise as an organization? So there needs to be that implement responsibly, they explore liberally, but implement responsibly. And if you ask yourself, well, what guides the implement responsibly part? There are a number of key factors there. The one is, change management bandwidth on your organization. The second is we do still default to technologies and ideas that are tested and that have had experience in the marketplace and that we can point to and that will serve us in terms of our relationship. And we look for long-term relationships, particularly when we talk about technology, that we can engage with and that we can influence. One of the benefits we'd look to in terms of a relationship with Countable would be how can we continue to co-evolve and not simply just evolve ourselves independently of the way Countable is going and allow the innovation within Countable to spill back into our world. So how do we create that bridge? So a number of factors, but I think, again, to sort of summarize those ideas is explore widely, but you need a filtration mechanism to allow yourself to decide on how are you going to implement responsibly.
Just to build on what you said, when I was in the public practice, we had three different components of the practice. The way we defined it was you have an engagement management process, you have a practice management, and you have a client / workflow / anything else that goes into that pool. And we always said the engagement management part is because we're doing so much of engagements with all the clients, the work part is extensive. So that covers almost 50-60% of the practice. 20-25% of the practice goes into practice management, and then the rest is just communication with the client, building the client base, managing people, and so on and so forth, and workflow, and a whole bunch of different aspects of it. So when we started thinking Countable, we said, which space do we want to be in? Do we want to be in all three? Or do we want to be in one? And eventually a long-term goal is to be in all three. But we started with the most difficult and most important part, which is the engagement management, engagement automation, and all those things. What is it from your side when you're looking at technologies, and just coming back and repeating it, framework is ready, buy-in is there, change is inevitable, we've decided it, we know what's coming and everything. We have shortlisted things that we're going to be looking at. How do you kind of take that out after that? Do you go out and say, I want to look at every possible option and then figure out what my top threes are and just narrow it down and so on and so forth and take one piece at a time? Like, share a little bit more around, how decision-making works in your world from your perspective.
Let's just talk about a workflow management system. We've been managing workflow for a long time. I mean, every organization manages its workflow in some way, shape, or form. So let's start with at least creating a rubric of what are the essential elements of a workflow management to us, the non-negotiables. What are the nice to have? What are the expansion possibilities? What are the relationships we want with the vendor? What kind of work behavior are we looking for our own workforce? How much mobility is important within that question? How much tethered to a desk is important to that question? How paperless are we? How paperless aren't we? So these are all the questions that would feed into an initial working group. And that needs to really be built up with a broad base of thinking across the organization of people who touching all elements of workflow. So, if I think about projects we've done internally, we always engage from the partners across the organization, through managers, through associates, and all the support functions as well. So some of the best ideas we get come from people who touch very unique parts of it, like the admin function, or IT might observe something that's particularly not apparent to everybody else, but might have a great influence on behavior. And even HR or marketing might play into some of the aspects of the way we manage the organization. So we want to absorb as much of that thinking around creating that matrix. Now, once we have that, then we'll traditionally have a 1 or 2 cycle iterations around driving our decision-making process to a single option, which we finally move on.
We look at people who are stressed, who don't have time for their family, who are running around, who are bottlenecked in those 5-6 months of the time frame, and there's not enough resources to be able to really have a breather, even for that matter. There's no reason for us to live in that bottleneck world, period. And to me, that is the fundamental reason why Accountable exists. For our perspective, is to give back time. Whether you choose to take the time to spend time with your family or to get more clients is completely an individual choice.
And I would add another dimension, because you sort of drift onto that people element of it. We talk about, in the accounting industry, if you ask most businesses what their largest challenge is today, people will be probably the number one. And what that often encompasses is the challenge of attracting and retaining talent for the perpetuity of the accounting businesses. But I think there's a much more pernicious element, which is also a people element. It's just less spoken about, but probably longer term going to be the one that's harder to deal with. And that's that the professional DNA of an accountant has changed. When I graduated university and I chose to become an accountant, and I started my accounting articles way back when in South Africa, the world was very much about, I knew what it was to be an accountant. I knew what the path was that got me to become whatever I thought the point of excellence was. I knew the commitment that I needed to invest. And I understood that the structure and the firm in which that was going to occur. So the environment, the path, the process, the commitment to that investment was a social contract among work and those who were working for organization that was well understood and fully committed to. That's no longer the case. And in many of the young people I speak to, and these people are smart and they're bright and they're committed, but that articulation of this is what an accounting career is about, and this is what I'm committed to, is something that simply doesn't resonate with them. They value different things. They value optionality. They value mobility. They value change. Sometimes they're less value driven by money as an outcome, and there are other incentives, and they're prepared to trade off against those incentives. All those elements are rubbing up against the traditional infrastructure, which still in most cases is managing accounting organizations. So when senior management and partners of organizations are saying we're challenged by people issues, I think they're right, and the symptomatic issues at the moment are attracting and retaining talent, but it doesn't go to the heart of the issue. The heart of the issue is that the young accountant today envisages their commitment to a career in accounting and to an accounting firm differently. And until that becomes properly scripted, the ability to weave that into a successful organization that continues to grow and change and mature in a direction that will be the accounting firm of the future remains challenged.
If you have a practice and you have 5 employees and 100 clients, And if there's always a choice between a client or an employee, who would you choose if there's a conflict?
It has to be case specific, and that's not simply avoiding the issue, because you need to create the integrity of your people. Your people are gold, and your people are what creates you as an organization. As you mentioned at the opening, my career starts, and I still practice on the valuation side, which leads itself in many cases to expert evidence in litigation settings. And I remember very early on in my career, a then senior lawyer in the community said to me, just remember as you grow that no client is ever worth your reputation. And that stuck with me for many, many years, because we obviously want to serve our clients best, but I think the sentiment is valid equally well with organizations. We should be constantly testing how we engage with our people and with our clients, and thinking about client acceptance criteria and constantly testing that. So I know it's a long-winded answer to what you thought was a simple question, but the only way to answer that question is what's being compromised in the choice, and what values of my client relationship versus my organizational relationship values am I prepared to compromise and not compromise in coming that decision. So it really is case specific.
I do want to leave a small note in case you have anything that you want to summarize or leave something for our audience when it comes to innovation, things that they should be looking out for, considering and doing that. If you just want to summarize that quickly, that would be great. Innovation
is not, as it's scripted, a Hollywood movie with a lightning bolt moment that just ends necessarily in a happy ending. It's a committed journey, and it's a long journey for many. And really, it's a way of life. I think for many organizations, and certainly I speak for an accounting firm, innovation just is a path that one has to opt into. And change management becomes part of the toolkit that you live with as an organization. And you've got to make sure that you're just managing and controlling it so that you set the speed correctly. And that speed is informed by how well you've articulated the vision, and most importantly, your people. Wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. That's all I have. Thank you for taking the time to do that. You're most welcome.